From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
Education is turning into a major flashpoint at the State House once again this year, including a bill that would significantly reduce how often teachers are evaluated. Supported by the teachers union and opposed by administrators, the bill breezed through the House and is now being considered by the state Senate. This week on Newsmakers, both sides of this debate and other major education policy issues, including the controversial kneecap test. Our guests, Executive Director of the Rhode Island Association of School Committees, Tim Duffy, and from Teachers Union, Rhode Island Federation of Teachers, James Parisi. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me on the panel, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nisi. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. It's good to have both of you back.
Thank you for having us.
So we have a lot to talk about. I do want to start with teacher evaluations. And as I said in the open, the main bill that passed through the House is House Bill 7096. And, this didn't just pass through the House, it was a complete landslide. I want to hear from each of your perspective how you would define that bill. Tim, we'll start with you.
Well, I think from our perspective, what it essentially does is it kind of guts the evaluation process. Right now, Rhode Island is one of 28 states that requires annual evaluation of teachers. This would put that off for highly effective teachers and effective teachers from 3 to 4 years. So roughly 47% of the teachers are listed as effective. Another 44% in that range are listed as highly effective. So if in effect, 95% of the teachers are going to be only evaluated on a 3 to 4 year cycle. And the problem is that the 95% is a result of grade inflation. 2/3 of the principals statewide admitted that they erred on the side of the teachers in evaluating them. So a lot of those initial rankings
This is a poll that came through Rhode, is that correct?
It's a survey that Rhode did.
Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. Jim, I want to hear your definition of 7096. I have a feeling you're not going to use the word gutted.
You won't hear that from me at all. So we really wanted to fix an existing system to make it sensible and reasonable. We wanted the General Assembly to step in to override some unnecessary, unproductive, bureaucratic state regs that require annual evaluation. We think that evaluations are important. Teachers welcome getting evaluated, but the requirement that everyone do the same thing every year is completely unnecessary. When teachers are rated effective or highly effective, they don't need to be evaluated every year. Quite frankly, we want administrators to focus on the brand new teachers and the teachers who had problematic evaluations. So in addition to the 5% that Tim cited about being developing or ineffective, please keep in mind that all the non-tenured teachers, probably 10% of the teacher workforce, are going to have annual evaluations as well.
Immediately, Jim, I can imagine people at home saying, I get evaluated at my job every year. I mean, Tim and I get evaluated here at PRI. I have lots of friends in different industries. Annual evaluations is a pretty common thing. Why is it so absurd that a teacher would get an annual evaluation of their performance?
Because a couple of years ago, the state adopted some regulations that when they required the annual evaluations, they also required that a majority of the teacher evaluation be student performance. So now we have teachers throughout the state jumping through all sorts of hoops, trying to create these measurable scores. We call them student learning objectives. It's really time consuming. Quite frankly, teachers really don't have as much of an issue with the administrator coming in, but spending 10 hours, 15 hours on creating student learning objectives, scoring them, maybe they get rejected, they have to redo them. We'd rather have teachers who are good spending that time preparing lessons for their kids.
Of the states that have evaluations, some of them are annual, some of them not. 44 of those states incorporate student performance as part of that evaluation. Over half of that 44 make it the primary focus of teacher evaluation. So this is not a new phenomenon to Rhode Island. Massachusetts does it, Connecticut does it, most of the states in the Northeast require it. So they're looking at student performance. That's the indicator. I think part of this is a mentality or culture that looks at evaluation either as a punitive measure or as a tool, an instructional measure to be able to improve your performance. If you look at it as a punitive measure, then you're going to take a position or an attitude that utilizing student test scores or student performance matrices are going to be in some way punitive to the teacher and possibly put their job in jeopardy. That's not the intent of the evaluation process.
Right, Jim, I get what he's saying. Don't teachers want this sort of annual feedback so they can get better? At this rate, 95% of teachers will get that help, to use another word, every 3 to 4 years. People can complete college degrees in faster time.
You don't need to have a formal evaluation process to have administrators check in with teachers, give advice, get teachers to come together and look at data on how their students are doing. That's happening already with Common Planning Time. It's going to continue to happen. What we object to is having this student learning objective process, this formal, rigid process that's time consuming, happen every year when it's not really helping student achievement. Teachers aren't looking to avoid feedback, but they've got problems with a process that the state created that teachers didn't have a real voice in, and that's why we had to go to the Assembly for some relief.
Tim?
Well, I mean, you have district evaluation committees that specifically, per Rhode's regulation, incorporates teachers and union representatives that are designed to provide feedback, designed to critically analyze how the evaluation process is working, and then get back to Rhode and get back to the district with recommendations and suggestions for changes. So that it's there. I mean, it's a feedback process. But again,
But their annual requirement is in state regulations. The student achievement being primary consideration is in state regulations.
So is the problem in your eye, Jim, annual valuations or these annual, you take annual evaluations that were structured differently? Because I hear you, sometimes it sounds like you're saying it's the student test thing that's the problem, but sometimes it just sounds like annual evaluations are the problem.
Well, they're tied together. They're tied
So
together
if they
by
were
our
untied?
state government. Maybe people would view it differently if the student achievement aspect wasn't so rigid and so prominent in these evaluations.
Again,
Look, we
it's-
represent teachers in a lot of urban school districts with challenging environments and challenging student bodies, and they're rightfully concerned.
And I read
that,
an op-ed that said that by getting rid of these evaluations, it would hurt those very school districts because teachers wouldn't be able to get the evaluation they need to move forward. You disagree?
I absolutely disagree. It's nonsense.
Well-
Look, to believe that principals aren't going to talk to their teachers about what's going on in schools, it's going to happen anyhow. You don't need that formal,
Is he
rigid
wrong?
process.
Well, there are two things in where work here. One, most of the states, of the 28 states that have annual evaluations, most of them have as a priority student performance, and which is student learning objectives, SLOs. Most of them have that incorporated into their evaluation system. Two, when you don't do evaluations and you don't do observation, because there's another component of this, there's an evaluation and there's observations. Most states, including Massachusetts and Connecticut, observe teachers up to 3 times of the year, beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of the year. So there's an observation process in addition to the evaluation. But when you don't do that, when you don't undergo that process, one of the things that you're kind of looking past are best practices. If a teacher is particularly innovative or is being able to reach students that heretofore hadn't been able you couldn't get to, you're missing that opportunity to exploit that and share it with a larger audience. So, I mean, if you look at this in purely a punitive context, you're going to want fewer evaluations,
Look,
and I don't think that that's what the intent of the process is.
If the commissioner and the State Board of Ed were more flexible and reasonable in creating a better evaluation system, we wouldn't have had to gone to the Assembly for relief.
Well,
but when you have state government,
micromanaging Rhode, do you feel good about? Do you think legislators have more education knowledge than the folks over at the Department of Education?
I think that the legislators are more responsive to the teachers' concerns than this commissioner is, and they're more responsive than this current Board of Education.
Because of primaries and lobbying and contributions and things like that.
No, I think it's because they're listening to teachers. And look, the ACLU had to take the Board of Ed to court to have them consider the whole kneecap graduation requirement issue. That's how unresponsive our current Board of Ed is.
Let me just offer a different perspective on that. Rhode has taken a look at a cyclical model, and they've agreed to move off of annual evaluations. And what they've agreed to do is highly effective teachers, where the proposal in the legislature would be every 4 years, they've agreed to every 3 years. For effective teachers, instead of every 3 years, they've agreed to every 2 years. So how much more do you want them to go?
They didn't give any relief on the student learning objective, which is the major driver of the time that is taken away from classroom instruction.
But student learning objectives are the whole point of evaluation. If we're not analyzing how students perform, why undergo the exercise of education at all?
How do we evaluate teachers in your eyes, then, if we're not doing it based on student performance?
No, we are doing it by student performance.
You don't
in
like
addition to administrator observations, in addition to people setting professional goals. We have a complex current evaluation system that is time consuming, and we would rather have a good evaluation system that's focused on people who need more help and the new teachers, the probationary teachers, and that's what we think our bill accomplishes.
Tim, I want to, we've been firing away at Jim a bit here, but what about, isn't some of the responsibility on bad teachers or potentially bad teachers with your school committees and the executives they hire to manage things? Because we see these stories come up about problems, and then it turns out there were tools available, but they were chicken or lazy or whatever you want to say, and people didn't go after the teachers who were real problems.
They didn't follow through on it. And I've worked with Channel 12 on stories about how difficult it is to terminate teachers. Some teachers that had criminal charges pending against them. Yes, it's extremely difficult. The problem that we're witnessing in this grade inflation that principals had for teachers happened with principals. 95% of the principals in the state were found to be effective or highly effective by superintendents. So this is part of the process of getting beyond that curve and getting into where people are comfortable. If you're talking about somebody's career and somebody's employment, you have a tendency to be really cautious about it. And I think the mistake is that everybody viewed these as punitive rather than using them as tools to improve
But what I'm hearing
administration.
what I'm hearing Tim say is that too many people are rated effective and highly effective. I disagree. I think Rhode Islanders...
Do you think 95% of teachers in this state are effective or highly effective?
Absolutely I do. And if you look at other states, I took a look at some New York State data the other day. They have similar numbers that we have, and I talked to some people who did some analysis of private sector evaluations. In the private sector, 95% or so of the workers are deemed effective or highly effective.
The same Rhode report that said that 2/3 of the building principals erred on the side of teachers also said that only 42% of the teachers surveyed felt that the evaluations reflected the effectiveness of instruction in their classrooms. So even the teachers themselves, when they looked at the evaluation numbers, said it really doesn't reflect what's going on in schools.
Because they don't have confidence that student learning objectives are accurate.
If 95% is grade inflation, what percent would match what you think is reality?
Well, then again, I'd have to take a look at the numbers. I don't know what, I mean, it depends on the system. It depends on, for one thing, as Jim points out, if you're going to use student learning objectives, then student learning objectives in Massachusetts, which are considerably more robust than Rhode Island's, you'd have a higher percentage of highly effective and they call it high-performing teachers. I think you have to let the system play itself out to find out where that level is.
We have to go to a break, and I'm very happy that Ted and I decided to have you guys on for the entire show and not just half the show, because we have a lot more that we want to talk about. And when we come back, Ted and I tend to like the politics of things. I want to see if we can find out what happened in the background here, particularly with this bill up on Smith Hill.
Sure.
Our guest this week is, he's the executive director of the Rhode Island Association of School Committees, Tim Duffy, and Jim Parisi from the American Federation of Teachers. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me on the panel, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi. Our guest this week, we have Tim Duffy from the Rhode Island Association of School Committees and Jim Parisi from the American Federation of Teachers. The first half was dominated by talking about House Bill 7096, and it would significantly reduce how often teachers are evaluated. Tim, this bill, as I said in the first half, didn't just pass. It passed. I think it was a 68-3 vote, a complete landslide. Yeah. What happened in the background here? A lot of people feel that when stuff like this happens, a trade was made.
Well, and this is purely speculation on my part, and I've been kicking around the State House now for 30-odd years. Representing cities and towns.
So it's educated speculation.
It's educated speculation. There were two bills that raised a lot of attention in the educational community this year. One was delaying the graduation requirements as a condition of NECAP as a condition of a graduation. And the other one was the evaluation bill. And a lot of attention, a lot of people showed up to testify on the NECAP graduation requirements in the House and the Senate. They were heard multiple times in both HEW committees, in the Education Committee and the Senate. And the Senate passed their version of it. But from my perspective, I think that the advocates for those bills were looking to see if they could get the evaluation bill. If they had their druthers, the evaluation bill would be the one that they were looking for.
Well, and Speaker Mattiello had made, he stood fast on the NECAP graduation requirement of that. So are you saying that because he did that, this other bill went through?
I would say that because he did that, the advocates for that bill and for the teacher evaluation bill essentially said we got to get one. And the sentiment in the House was to go with the evaluation bill.
Primaries looming, Jim. Was that the case? It's got to be one or the other?
No, absolutely not. We support both bills. We're hopeful that the Assembly passes both bills this year. And I don't know how much time we have to talk about NECAP, but it's something that our union supports. We're thankful that the Senate passed that one overwhelmingly through their chamber. The teacher evaluation bill was not an initial issue of this year. Last year, we put in legislation that tried to diminish the student learning portion of teacher evaluations that were unsuccessful, and part of the feedback we got was people felt uncomfortable playing with that. So we thought as a follow-up, then we'll just talk about the frequency, and that's part of the genesis of this bill. I think it passed so strongly because not hundreds, but thousands of teachers have reached out to their elected officials complaining about the current process and talking about the need for it. I think from conservative to liberal, you see everyone supported this bill. I think the conservatives understood that unnecessary bureaucratic state regulations that don't advance student achievement ought to be restricted. You hear overregulation being talked about in the business community all the time. This is an example of overregulation in the education industry, and we think that our issue did resonate. There's been absolutely no trade. We're going to work real hard to get Senator Goodwin's bill through the Senate. She's our Senate sponsor on the evaluation issue. And we're going to work hard, and we don't think it's a foregone conclusion that the House won't act on the NECAP issue.
What about on the Senate? I mean, that tends to be labor-friendly. Tim, do you anticipate the evaluation bill is going to pass?
We're going to put up a fight, and we'll offer recommendations and amendments to the legislation to see if we can bring some balance to what's going on.
And just for the viewers' information, the strategy in the House for our opponents was not to offer amendments or middle ground. It was just to try and defeat it. They were unsuccessful, so we'll wait to see what they have to put on the table.
Was that because you were caught off guard, or
no?
what?
I think it was because our position was that none of this belongs in a statutory framework. The legislature approves the members of the Board of Education. If they're not happy with how the department is operating, then they don't have to confirm them. But putting into statute the frequency of evaluations, I think, is one, it clutters up the legislation, and two, it's wholly inappropriate, because even if the unions come back with a system that they feel is more robust than they want, then we've got to go to the legislature and change it again. It doesn't belong in statute. I mean, that's always been our position. Absolutely no, this is not the venue for this issue.
The irony of this is that for decades, Tim's members and my members sat down at the bargaining table in each individual school community to figure out teacher evaluation. But, it's not like teachers weren't evaluated before 2010.
But do you want that sort of patchwork of teacher evaluations district by district, and they do it one way in Portsmouth and they do it at, I mean, is that...
There was actually a lot more commonality than that.
This would eviscerate that process. So we're not even going back to the old process. We're essentially delaying or deferring any evaluation system for 3 to 4 years. We can't even go back to the old process under 1629. That's what this bill would do.
I have a different political question. Jim, do you think the AFT will endorse a candidate for governor this year?
I am not sure what we're going to do about the governor's race. We recently, just this past week, have conducted some candidate interviews, not only for governor, but for all statewide offices. We're not going to actually sit down and take a look at what actions we're going to take until later in June, or later than that. We have a sense on at least waiting until the filing deadline.
The assumption will be
us.
you're going to go with Clay Pell because he's the teachers union candidate. I mean, does he have the inside track?
I don't know that anyone has the inside track right now. He's certainly a strong candidate who has a story to tell about public education, but there are a lot of considerations that we need to take a look at in terms of candidates and their viability and their track record. I think there's arguments to be made for other candidates as well.
Even Gina Raimondo?
We had her in. I unfortunately had another meeting and I missed her interview, but never say never in the world of politics. That's all I could say right now.
So I did want to touch on NECAP, and specifically Providence. They passed a waiver this week, and that meant they essentially got rid of the testing portion of the graduation requirement. 200 students who scored a 1 out of 4, which is substantially below proficient, will graduate. What do you guys weigh in on that? Do you agree? Do you disagree with what the school board did there? Tim?
Well, I mean, from our perspective, one of the reasons that the graduation requirement came into existence was to force districts to begin to align their curriculum to standards. And there's always been this debate that the consequence, the fallout from that, would be that students wouldn't graduate from high school. I understand that a lot of waivers have been granted. I understand that some people may say that that somehow diminishes the process. But our problem was change is difficult, and getting systems as big as school districts to change, it's a glacial sort of momentum. If they don't align their curriculum to those standards, then there are always going to be problems on assessments, whether it's NECAP or PARC. So from our association's perspective, the essence of the graduation requirement was to force districts to begin to change their curriculum, especially in mathematics, to come into alignment with the standards. And the standards are good standards.
How about you, Jim?
Well, unfortunately for the students of Providence, they had to wait until this waiver process was finally enacted. Unfortunately, our State Board of Ed didn't grant the relief that was necessary. NECAP was never designed to be a graduation requirement kind of test, and unfortunately was. We're pushing a moratorium, not necessarily a cessation of using standardized tests as a graduation requirement, even though we have a lot of people who would support a complete cessation. I think what Providence did, they did something necessary because of an unfortunate situation.
Do you feel good about them walking out the door and being prepared? Those two, specifically those 200 students, is it that you think NECAP is so flawed that that's just wrong, bad data?
I think it is bad data. I think it's unfair to kids.
Are they ready to graduate?
I think it's unfair to kids to test them on material they haven't even taken in school.
But that's
happened.
Therein lies the process.
That's happened.
You cannot change unless there's a consequence attached to this. Those curriculums won't change. We've been under NECAP how long? And now all of a sudden certain school districts are aligning their curriculum to the standards? This is how long it's taken.
And these kids are guinea pigs?
And guess what? All of the students before them were graduating not meeting standard.
Actually, we have a new set of standards in place because NECAP was created before the Common Core, the new set of standards, was even adopted.
Actually, I had a question about the Common Core, and I know we're running short on time, Tim, but there's been a blowback nationally that's gathered pace and surprised some ed reformers to these Common Core standards, these national ed curriculum standards that are rolling out. I haven't heard as much of that here, though maybe I've just missed it, so I would just like each of you briefly to weigh in. Do you see blowback toward Common Core coming in Rhode Island? Do you think they could be scrapped? Jim first.
My union, both at the state as well as the national level, has supported Common Core standards. We need standards. We might as well have standards aligned with the rest of the country if they make sense. Our issue hasn't been with the standards themselves, but how they're rolled out. Again, the use of standardized tests is something we object to. Not having teachers trained and have time to implement them before high stakes tests are implemented is another issue that we have a problem with.
Tim, Common Core?
If you don't have standard assessments that reflect the standards, how do you know whether you're meeting the mark? I mean, that's a basic question. If you don't have a test that measures how effective
Tim, I didn't
the
say
instruction
tests.
is,
I said high-stakes tests.
Well,
I mean,
think you said
attaching a
tests,
graduation requirement is the wrong thing.
But whether it's a high-stakes test or an assessment in any context, that's how you measure standards. And, you know, relative to Park, I think what Park does is rather than you have a wide curriculum that's an inch deep, it focuses more on core elements. That's hence the name of the Common Core Standards. It's more, it drills down more into math, it drills down more into science, it drills down more into English.
All right, gentlemen, we are out of time. This show seriously could be an hour long. If you missed any of it, it's online, WPRI.com. The guy in the New York Yankees tie is Jim Parisi from the American Federation of Teachers. Jim Duffy from the Rhode Island Association of School Committees. For Ted Nisi, I'm Tim White. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.